vite dans le coin là-bas. Tous, merci beaucoup d'être là. Comme vous le savez à peu près tous, le whisky, c'est une affaire de temps, c'est une affaire d'expérience. Or, James qui est ici avec nous a 40 ans d'expérience dans le whisky. Ça fait partie de ces grandes figures qu'on est très 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 fiers d'avoir avec nous. Et il travaille aujourd'hui pour l'une des dernières grandes distilleries qui est ouverte en Écosse, sur l'île d'Arran. Donc la distillerie d'Arran, je vous demande d'accueillir très chaleureusement notre intervenant. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. My name's James MacTaggart. I'm from the Isle of Arran Distillers, but as you know by my accent, probably I'm from the Isle of Islay, which I'm sure most of you as whisky drinkers are very familiar with. But the Isle of Arran and Arran Distillers is actually quite unique because in 1995, Arran Distillery sort of started up. And it was the first new distillery in Scotland for many, many years, because in the 70s and 80s and part of the 90s, the whisky industry in Scotland was very, very, there was a lot of distillery closures. And Arran Distillery was the very first of the new distilleries. And it was another 10 years after Arran opened before Kilcommon Distillery actually opened. So we were really the trailblazers in the start of the new distilleries in Scotland. And if you're not sure where Arran Distillery is, this is a picture of Arran because it's a very, very hilly island. And here we are. So here's Scotland here, and this is the Isle of Arran here. So it's very close to the Isle of Islay. So in 2007, I sort of jumped in a ship and went from here and into here. So in 2007, I went to Arran. And I was very, very fortunate when I went to Arran that Arran was actually sort of, it wasn't the best of distilleries at that time. And I was very fortunate that in the next 10 years after that, there was a huge investment, about £5 or £6 million in Arran. So I was given, I was made very quickly a director of Isle of Arran Distillers and the title of Master Distiller, and I was given a huge budget to actually improve what Isle of Arran Distillery was all about. And we've arrived today where we are seen by many people, and I'm sure yourselves, as many fans in the audience here, of being one of the top single malt whiskies coming out of Scotland. Before I go any further, I'm going to let you taste the first whisky, which is a 10-year-old. So this is Lucy Coomber. Lucy's our sales manager who covers the French market for us. So Lucy's going to go through the first 10-year-old for you. So that's number one.
Merci et bienvenue. Thank you very much for having us here at Whisky Live. Delighted to be here, and I believe it's both our first time at Whisky Live ever, at Whisky Live Paris. So the first dram that we have for you to try today is our 10-year-olds, and it's a fantastic way to start for many reasons. Not only do you have a delicious dram of Arran... Oh, there's some missing potentially at the back. Est-ce qu'il y a... C'est déjà fini ou... Bon. So we're going to start with a 10-year-old, and as I say, not only do you have a delicious dram of Arran in your glass, this is a great way to start if you really want to get under the skin of our Arran character. James will go into this a bit later, but we've got a very light and fruity character, which is something that you'll notice as we progress through the tasting. You'll notice this Arran identity in each bottle. And this is something that I think is so important nowadays when there are plenty of distilleries all over Scotland with their own unique character. You'll definitely notice this Arran stamp on each bottle and in the whiskey you drink. So the first is our Arran 10, or as my colleague Andy likes to call, a back bar staple. It's non-chill filtered and 46%. We also don't add colour to our whiskey. Even though it's a 10-year-old, it is very round and it's got lovely bursts of fresh citrus, apple and malt flavour on the nose. That's the Arran stamp character you'll find, this lovely fresh green apple and the malt. For our Arran 10-year-old, what we've done is it's mainly ex-bourbon barrel matured, using mainly first fill ex-bourbon barrels, but we also have some ex-Oloroso sherry casks in there as well to get a really nice balance between the two. And you'll start to pick that up, especially when you take your first sip. Again, that lovely Arran character is definitely there. You've got the hints from the ex-bourbon barrels. You've got some vanilla sweetness, a little bit of coconut. But right at the end, you get the spiciness that comes through from the ex-sherry casks. It's also got a very rounded and long finish for a 10-year-old whiskey. So James, when he joined the distillery, is really focused on getting the best casks for us to use, and that's so important because the cask itself will give majority of the flavour and the colour to the whiskey, so it's important to have a really good source of casks. One thing as well, we're delighted to be launching our new packaging today. It's the first time we've brought our new packaging to a whiskey fair in France, so I'm delighted to be able to share that with you today.
Thank you, Lucy. Just a wee bit more about what Isle of Arran Distillers is. Isle of Arran Distillers has actually got only 5 directors. I'm the production director. We've got Ewan Mitchell, the managing director, and we've got Les Auchincloss, who's the major shareholder, and we've got Ray Tully and Mike Pearce as our chairman. So it's a very, very small board of directors, and it means that decisions are made very, very quickly, and any direction or change in the company can happen overnight. The distillery itself, it was everybody, I'm sure most of you in here have got a dream of starting your own distillery, and this happened with Harold Curry, who was the managing director of Shivers Brothers, and he was retiring, and his dream was to have his own distillery, and he was wondering, where would I build this distillery? So I think it was in a dinner in Glasgow, it was suggested to him, why do you not try the Isle of Arran? Because Isle of Arran, like the Isle of Islay, had an awful lot of distilleries in the Isle of Arran, but they were all basically farm distilleries, an awful lot of them illegal, but there's a huge distilling history in Arran as well. So in 1995, Isle of Arran Distillery actually opened, and the first manager in there was Gordon Mitchell, who came from Cooley Distillery in Ireland. So Gordon was actually responsible for the first from 1995 to 2007, when I took over in 2007. This is the distillery itself. Has anybody in here visited the distillery? Yep. So it's in 2 years ago, the distillery was actually, we were capable of probably producing about 500,000, 600,000 litres of alcohol. But we decided that, with sales growing, interest in the distillery, we decided we'd have to double the production. So in 2 years ago, we put in another 2 wash stills, 2 spirit stills, which were identical to the first 2, so that we're creating exactly the same spirit. So there was a £2 million investment in that. And then the directors decided that everything that we produce in Arran must be matured in Arran. So every single drop of spirit in Arran is now warehoused there, because it's actually very, very important for us to have the right conditions for the Arran single malt to mature in. So the maturation, we've built 4 new warehouses at Lochranza, and we've now built a second distillery down in Lag, which is about 20 miles away from the existing distillery, and that distillery is going to produce a very heavily peated malt. Although in Lochranza, we've produced 20 ppm peated and 50 ppm peated, but now all the peated malt is going to move to the new distillery, and we're going to only be doing an unpeated malt at Lochranza. I'm going to pass you back to Lucy, who's going to go through the second one. We're very, very conscious. We've only got half an hour here.
And with that, I'm sure you'll be equally as thirsty as your first dram, so we'll move on to our second one. So this time we're going from 46%, which is how we have our main core range. We've also got some expressions where we've played with using cask strength as part. So this is slightly a bit more punchy. It's 56.2%. And we've done something slightly different with this. As I say, we've been very conscious with the different type of casks we use. So with our quarter cask, some of you might have been familiar with the Bodega, the bothy previously. So it's a similar concept, but we've focused the name on the quarter cask element. So for this whiskey, we have 2 stages. The first stage starts in hogsheads, where we mature the whiskey for 7 years. And these are in American oak. So again, you've got that nice sweet touch to the whiskey. So you've got some vanilla, coconut, maybe a bit of a candy floss on the nose. But what we do after the 7 years is we put the whiskey in a different cask. This time we've used 125 litre casks called quarter casks, hence the name. And with this gives you a sort of second maturation that is a bit quicker. There's more liquid to wood ratio, and because of that, or there's more liquid and wood contact, and that speeds up the maturation to give you another layer of complexity on top of that whiskey. So this time you get more of a tropical fruit element to this whiskey. You'll notice some pineapple and some banana in particular when you take your first sip. Slight hint of sort of chili spice at the end, again with the nice fresh American oak casks used. Another interesting thing about the quarter casks and why we've used them at the distillery, as James has said, we have a long history of whiskey production on the Isle of Arran, but quite a lot of illegal distilling. So in the past, when illegal distilling was happening, by using smaller casks at that time, slightly easier to hide in the bothies, the smaller sort of houses tucked away on Arran. And so it's quite nice being able to kind of bring part of the history back to our whiskey.
Thank you, Lucy. I'll just go through some of the through some of the production of Isle of Arran distillery. The water, when you're doing an unpeated spirit, like most of our spirit at Lochranza is done, you've got to have a very clear, untainted water supply. And the water supply at Lochranza comes, and it's basically, the site where the distillery is built was built because of the water supply. Because if you're doing an unpeated whiskey, you've got to have a very, very clean, untainted water. Because if you're doing a peated spirit, basically the quality of the water doesn't have to be that great, because the peat and the smokiness can sort of hide anything in there that's, any unwanted flavours in there. But if you're doing an unpeated whiskey, it's got to be very, very clean, clear water. And we get the water from Loch na Davi, which Loch na Davi is an old Gaelic name for the Loch of the Deer, where many, many years ago the deer used to drink from that loch. And it comes down a river called Glen Essen-Bidach. And Essen-Bidach is old Gaelic words for the glen of the sharp waterfalls. So the sharp waterfalls actually aerate the water a wee bit and actually helps to clean the water before we take it out of the river. And we take the water out of the river we take about 25,000 litres an hour of water out of the river, but most of that is for production, for actually the cooling of the spirit, because some of the Islay distilleries have got lathes maybe 6-7 miles long, and by the time the water gets down there, it's not so cool, pure and clear. But in Loch Ranza, we've got very pure, clear water for our production. The mash tun itself, we've got a 2.5 ton mash tun, and we do 2.5 ton at a time. And we've got our malt, our malted barley. We do not have our own maltings. We use commercial malt, and this year it was crisp maltings we are using. We're looking for a very, very strong yield of about 405 to 408 litres of pure alcohol per tonne. And then that's a 2.5 tonne, goes into a 13,000 litre washback, where we add 50 kilograms of yeast. And the yeast we get from a company called Kerry, which is actually an Irish company, but it's a yeast that's made specially for the whisky industry. It's an M-strain yeast, it's called. And after that, the fermentation process takes about 72 hours. After 72 hours, you've got what's basically a beer at about 8% strength. So our average fermentation time is about 72 hours, and then we transfer that back into we transfer that into our wash charger, where we put it into the 2 wash stills. We've got 6,500 litres into 2 wash stills. We run them off. They come in at a strength about 52%. We run that down to 0.2%. And then that's the low wines. The second distillation is the spirit distillation. That comes in normally about 74%. And after 25 minutes of 4 shots, because the 4 shots are full of all the impurities that you don't want in your spirit. So we're very, very clear that these 25 minutes are very important. And then we run the spirit stills for about 2.5 hours. And the spirit run is basically about 7 litres per minute. Between 6 and 7 litres per minute is actually quite slow in the whisky industry. So it gives us that. It gives the spirit that time to rise up the stills. We get a lot of reflux there, so that by the time it comes to the top of the still and round into the condenser, it's a nice, sweet, light spirit. And that's what we're looking for, and that's what comes out in our finished products. So after that, we collect 2.5 hours, and then of course, it goes into faints after that. And then we transfer it to the filling store, where we reduce it down to 63.5% for filling into casks. Now, the cask we use at Loch Ranza, well, I'll let Lucy do the next one, and then I'll tell you about our maturation.
Fantastic. So how have you enjoyed the first two whiskies so far? Good? A few nodding heads? Yes? Brilliant. So as James has mentioned, the water source that we have at Arran is very pure, and water is one of the key ingredients for making your lovely whiskey and your final product. So what we've done is, with our new packaging, you'll see on the bottle, we've tried to reflect this concept of the importance of our water source on our bottles. So you can see the ripple right at the top of the bottles, and also a slight sort of water droplets on the base as well. So little subtle details to kind of celebrate the purity of the water that we use in creating our lovely Arran whiskey. Now, as James had also mentioned, we're a very young distillery compared to a few that can be found in Scotland. And we've also managed to play with our flavors with using different casks. So we've seen a combination of sherry and bourbon. We've seen bourbon and quarter casks with a second, but you'll note you can still get that Arran identity in each dram, the lovely rich apple, citrus, and also slightly malty flavours. For our third dram that we've got, our third whiskey, it's a fantastic thing for us to be able to show you, because this is the first time ever we've done a sherry cask strength as part of our core range. So this we've called the Bodega, to celebrate the idea of the sherry casks that we've used. This is also a 7-year-old sherry matured whiskey, and I will go on to the tasting thing so you can see it as well. So it's matured in some of the finest sherry casks that we've got. Again, very picky with the casks we use, and we wanted to kind of use the same style of sherry casks as possible that we would have used back when the distillery first started. So really fine, classic quality sherry casks. This also is a nice cask strength number for you. It's 55.8%. But although it's 55.8, it's one that has a bit of a spicy undertone to it, but it's still very round and very smooth. What I love about the nose of our Bodega whiskey, it almost kind of brings you to Jerez, where sherry is made. It's kind of like walking through a really nice, it's a dusty Bodega warehouse where all these sherry casks are sitting, and eventually, hopefully, coming to us to use. So with kind of that sherry element, you'll get lots of dark, dried fruits, raisins, sultanas, that kind of thing. But with this particular whiskey on the nose, you almost get slightly lighter red fruits, more like bramble. I learned the word for bramble in French only last week, mûre sauvage, I think. So that's the type of character that really shines through. Again, on the palate, really nicely a classic sherry. It's not a sherry bomb. We've got those sort of different layers of the sherry starting to peel away as you sort of let it sort of develop in your mouth. You've almost got that sort of like orange citrus note there, and still that kind of malty Arran character that's infamous with our whiskies. It's also got a lovely robust finish, very long, kind of a dusting of cocoa powder on the end. But it's a really lovely example of combining our spirit character with the lovely sherry casks that we've used for this expression.
Yep, you got the balance. There's absolutely no point in producing a very, very good new spirit if you're not going to put it into good wood. And as I said, in 2007, when I came to Arran, the wood policy was not great. So that's one of the first things. When I was at Bowmore, one of the things I learned, Andy Rankin was the production director, and he came into Bowmore probably in about middle 80s, and he changed the wood policy completely. And I learned very, very quickly that a wood policy for a distillery is absolute. You can't get by without having a great wood policy. So the wood policy I started up in 2007 when I came to Arran was to buy first fill bourbons. So at the moment, what we fill is 80% first fill bourbons. We have a mixture. Some distilleries like to stick to the same bourbon makers, but something I don't do is because I like to blend some of the different bourbon casks together. So we have Jim Beam, we have Jack Daniels, Heaven Hill, Buffalo Trace. So there's a large range of different bourbons that we fill at Lochranza. So 80% of the fillings at Lochranza are first fill bourbons. We fill 10% sherry hogsheads and about 10% refills. The bourbon cask we always use twice and then we get rid of. The sherry hogsheads we'll use 3 times, because the bourbon casks, after being used twice, you'll get very, very little out of them after that. So the maturation is very, very important. We have, as I said already, we've built new warehouses in Arran because of the Gulf Stream and the climate we get in Arran. It's very, very important, and it's very, very good for maturation there. And on the other hand, it's very, very good for us to have access to our casks. So basically, I'm also the blender I've got various titles. I'm the production director, the distillery manager, and the master blender for Arran. So I'm responsible for putting the spirit together for all these casks. So if anything goes wrong, there's only one man gets the blame, and unfortunately that's me. But it's a very, very enjoyable job, because I've been in the industry for 44 years, believe it or not. I spent nearly 30 years working all the different shifts, from 6 to 2 to night shifts. I remember the day in the heyday of the whisky industry. I used to go home at 6 o'clock on a Saturday morning, out again at 2 o'clock. You were working 7 days a week. And nowadays, people really don't want to do that. They want to do the 5 days and then go home. But in these days, when the whisky was very, very... most of the malted whiskies in these days were actually exported. And now, of course, every distillery wants to keep their own single malts. We don't sell any of our single malt. Everything that we produce stays in Arran. We do not sell to anybody outside ourselves. Every single litre of alcohol we produce, we keep for ourselves, and we'll be using for the future sort of bottlings like these. The maturation, we've got in Arran, we've got 2 dunnage warehouses, we've got 1 racked warehouses, and we've got 2 palletised warehouses. Palletised warehouses, I find, are just as good as racked warehouses, because you're getting more contact with the wood if it's sitting up the way, because there's very little contact. In a cask, there's very little flavours come out at the end of the cask. So if you've got the cask sitting up, you've got much more contact with the staves, and it's where the staves in the casks, that's where all the flavours are, not in the ends. So palletised, some people don't like palletised warehousing, but palletised actually is very, very good for maturation. I'll just give you something else that was happened in Arran, is that we've now built a second distillery in Arran, and I'm not sure whether our friends at the back have visited the second distillery yet. Have you been there? You have, yes. So we built Lag Distillery, which is about 20 miles away from Lochranza Distillery, because it became very evident to us that there's a growing need in the whisky industry for peated whisky. And they're becoming more and more popular. So the company decided to invest in a company that produced only peated whisky, and it's only heavily peated whisky we're going to produce down at Lag. We've built 3 warehouses down there. We're going to build another 3 warehouses down there. As I said already, it's very, very important for the company that all our maturation happens on the island. The distillery down there, the distillery at Lochranza now can produce 1.2 million litres of alcohol a year. The one down in Lag is probably in the region of 800,000 litres of pure alcohol. But what we've done with the Lag distillery, we've built it so that we can double all the production unit within the existing building. So it's been future-proof, basically, so that if we need any extra capacity in the future, the building is already there. We won't have to put a new building up for that. So Isle of Arran Distillers is a very forward-looking company. Even though our major shareholder and our biggest investor is 87 years old, he still wants to see us grow. And it's very, very good for the company that somebody of that age has so much foresight to want to see his company growing. Before we finish up, I always like to have a wee bit of interaction with people in the crowd. Is there anybody who would like to ask about any questions about Arran? And are you all quite happy to... Anybody getting... Yes.
Sorry for my accent.
That's okay.
I hope you understand me. So my question is about all the steps of the process that you mentioned. So is there one in your mind that is influencing more the character of the Arran whiskey?
There are two basic elements for the character of the whisky, and one is the length of the fermentation. Longer the fermentation you get, the sweeter the spirit you'll get. And the second element is the actual distillation process itself, is that if you run the stills slow enough, you'll get a sweeter spirit. If you want a heavier spirit, you push the stills. There's Alan Rutherford, who's a very famous sort of consultant in the Scotch whisky industry, reckons that the shape of the stills is not hugely important. It's how you run the stills and the speed that you run the spirit off the stills. And I slightly agree with him. I think maybe not totally agree with him, because I think the shape of the still does have imparts in the style slightly and the flavours, but it's the speed you run the stills at. So that's why we run the stills very slowly at Lofranza, so that we get that light spirit. Does that answer your question? Good. Anybody else got anything they would like to ask? No, you are all listening intently there. I think I've been told at the back here that our time is probably up. So I thank you, on behalf of Lucy and myself, I thank you all for coming along today. I hope you've enjoyed the drinks. And we've got the stand through here. If you'd like to visit the stand and try some of our other spirits, that would be absolutely brilliant. So thank you all very much.